Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, July 3rd, 2020, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the top three choices for Joe Biden's presidential campaign ticket, meaning they would be the VP, and discuss the excitable rating and the acceptable rating and the non-acceptable rating for each of these individual candidates. So there are a number of candidates that were, polled for amongst Democrats from the USA Today Suffolk University poll that was released, I believe, on June 30th, but the data wasn't really compiled until I believe it was probably taken on the 30th and then released on the 2nd of July. But this data shows that, number one, Joe Biden is expected to choose a woman of color as vice president. So most people in the poll decided that it was important in some degree, important to them that Joe Biden chose a woman of color as his vice president. Now, there were around a third of respondents amongst Democrats that said it was very crucial and super important, and then another third that said it was slightly important, but he still definitely should, and then the rest were not concerned about the color of the vice president's skin. So when we take a look at the candidates that I'm showing you, there were other candidates polled, Stacey Abrams, Keisha Lance Bottoms, but these are the top three that top Democrats who are very close to the Biden campaign say are within the top three contenders. This list can change, and things definitely do as more information comes out about each individual candidate, but Kamala Harris seems to be as the top choice, even though Elizabeth Warren outperformed her in terms of the excitability rating, but has the also highest not acceptable rating amongst Democrats. So taking a look at these top three, again, we are dividing it based off excited, acceptable, and not acceptable. And as you can see, these three possible choices, the most that they have a not acceptable rating is 12% for Senator Kamala Harris. Then it goes down to 10% for former Ambassador Susan Rice, and then 8% for Representative Val Demings. Val Demings does not have a lot of ratings because most people do not know exactly who she is, so they didn't have necessarily an opinion. If you go ahead and take a look, right here, 65% of respondents did not know enough about her as a potential candidate. So they asked a number of potential vice presidential choices, but I've decided to just narrow it down to these three. And I do think that Senator Kamala Harris will likely be the vice presidential choice. Now, if you asked me that a year ago, right as these debates were happening, I would have said absolutely not. Biden hates Senator Harris. There's already an issue between Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So it just didn't seem realistic. But now it seems very plausible that Joe Biden just does choose Senator Kamala Harris. And yes, they all have a shaky record, I guess you could say. They could directly tie Susan Rice to anything under the Obama administration, as they would with Joe Biden. They could tie Kamala Harris to her former record as a prosecutor in California. And the fact that Representative Val Demings was a police chief, a former police chief, I think, right now, given everything that's still occurring, there are numerous protests happening around the country. Just because the media is not talking about it doesn't mean that it's not happening. I do think that will also work against her as a possible choice for VP. And it doesn't seem like she's too well known. As you can see, taking a look at these numbers, barely 40%, not even 40% of respondents know exactly who Val Demings is, meaning the remainder, 65%, don't exactly know enough about her to make form an opinion about her. So I would say that if we were to narrow down this list to two candidates, it would be Susan Rice or Kamala Harris. But it seems Kamala Harris has the highest excitability rating. And it is important that you have an exciting vice presidential candidate, because if you take a look at the data we have on Joe Biden, a lot of voters that are voting for him are voting to get Trump out and not necessarily for Joe Biden. Compared to Donald Trump, he still has that enthusiasm stretch, but again, enthusiastic votes and non-enthusiastic votes all count the same. So I think it only matters in terms of bringing out turnout, but Donald Trump may have an enthusiastic 40% of the country, and Joe Biden may have the non-enthusiastic 55% of the country. One of them's going to win the election, and it's not the enthusiastic one. So I think it only matters in terms of bringing out turnout, and if you choose any of these women of color as VP, by the time we hit the election, everyone will know everything about them, and they will likely be either not excited or excited by them as a VP choice, or maybe just, whatever, if it's someone like, let's say, Susan Rice. 35% of Democrats said it would be acceptable, but they weren't exactly excited, but they didn't say it was not acceptable. For Kamala Harris, more people were actually excited than view her as acceptable. So that means the majority of the Democratic Party, same thing with Susan Rice, view them positively, meaning they would be either comfortable or very excited with them as a potential VP choice. So this poll actually showed Joe Biden, I believe, ahead about, I believe it should be question number, oh wow, this is a very, very large poll. Let's go ahead and move all the way up to the top. I just realized how much they were actually asking, so I don't know. Okay. Yeah, here we go. Banner one, total. So if the November general election were held today and the choices were Republican Donald Trump and Democrat Joe Biden or third-party candidate, for whom would you vote or lean towards? And 37% of respondents said they would vote for Joe Biden. 46% said they would vote for Donald Trump. 37 for Donald Trump. 46 for Joe Biden. 11% said they would vote for a third-party candidate. I don't think that's true. They definitely are going to break for one side or the other on election day. And 5% are currently undecided. So if we take a look at the overall numbers, Joe Biden does trounce Donald Trump in this poll, 9% nationwide, which means that, yes, they're working amongst a group that is favorable to Joe Biden. But when they're polling about the possible VP choice, they're polling that amongst registered Democrats, not necessarily amongst independent-leaning Democrats or Joe Biden independents or Joe Biden Republicans, but purely Democrats. And I really only think that Democrats truly matter in terms of who they choose as VP, because independent candidates are probably going to choose off who's the top of the ticket, not who's on the bottom of the ticket. Whereas the vice president usually only factors in balancing out Joe Biden. I think putting up someone who would be classified as an old white man, someone who's a staple of politics, sure, known around the country and pretty well liked, very different than Hillary Clinton, but counteracting that with a woman, especially a woman of color, on the other side of the ticket definitely would, in optics view, make it a lot easier for some people to vote for Joe Biden, just because of the fact with a number of, race relations being the number one issue in this country right now per the CNN poll, over coronavirus, over the economy, over healthcare. I mean, the last time race relations were a number one issue, we were talking about the civil rights movement. So I do think that it is very important that Joe Biden does choose a woman of color. I understand 27% of the Democratic Party doesn't think it matters. I do personally think it matters. I definitely think it could make or break the election. I understand that based off a number analysis, Elizabeth Warren does increase Joe Biden's chances the best, but based off of just a face value assessment, as we continue through the election season, I definitely think it'll be better off for Joe Biden's campaign if he chooses a woman of color. Because in 2016, they had a white woman, as the top of the ticket, and then they chose Senator Tim Kaine. And that didn't necessarily end up with anything good. Julian Castro was in the running for the longest time, and that did not end up being chosen. I will say that in this 2020 race, I think it is important for Joe Biden to at least have a woman of color on his ticket, just to counteract and make sure minorities know that they have someone who's an advocate for them in the White House based off of personal experience, I guess you could say. I think a lot of Obama's enthusiasm amongst black voters obviously was rooted in the fact that he would be the first black president. A lot of the minority vote that came out for Obama that was previously not turning out in large numbers. I mean, African-American turnout in 2012 was larger than, not larger, but percentage-wise larger than white turnout. More potential black voters voted than potential white voters. Now, since the African-American population only makes up 13% of the country, it didn't have as much of an impact. Obviously, if it was equal, there would have been a landslide election just based off the splits. But as we progress through this election, Hillary Clinton only got 59% turnout. It went from 66 to 59. Joe Biden will need something fundamentally to change in the campaign to drive up African-American turnout, and I definitely think it will be choosing a woman of color as VP. And taking a look at these numbers, they aren't so bad. People always talk about Kamala Harris is hated by the Democratic Party. She doesn't look like it. Susan Rice wouldn't be a good choice. Nobody really knows her. Doesn't look like it. Now, Val Demings, I think, sure, coming from Florida, would be beneficial in the aspect that those 29 electoral votes would become even more solid for Joe Biden. But I think if he chose Kamala Harris, it would make a number of other races super competitive. North Carolina, Georgia, narrowing down Senate races in Alabama or South Carolina. And I do think that increasing minority turnout in Detroit and Milwaukee and Philadelphia, key areas that didn't turn out as large of numbers that we saw in 2012 and 2008, that ultimately ended up with the Donald Trump presidency. So Joe Biden, I think he's in good company. Looking at all of these names, it seems the Democratic Party likes them, and obviously the Republican Party isn't going to like them, so he doesn't need their approval. And independents seem to be, they probably aren't going to vote for a certain candidate just because of their vice presidential choice. There were not that many independents, I could say, in full confidence, that a lot of them voted for Donald Trump because they liked Donald Trump's ideas, not because they liked Mike Pence on the second part of the ticket. Or a lot of independents that voted for Hillary Clinton maybe were voting against Donald Trump, but also for Hillary Clinton, not for Tim Kaine. So really, I think the VP choice only matters in terms of solidifying your base, and then also increasing voters, which are Democratic voters, increasing turnout amongst voters that didn't vote in 2016 but voted in 2008 or voted in 2012. I know plenty of people that voted in 2008, and that was the last election they voted in. And these people that I know, they're in Maryland, they're in California, they're in New York, solid Democratic states. But also, if they're not voting in those safe states, it's not just because it's a safe state, but they've haven't been too excited by a potential choice for president. Obama was able to turn out numerous voters in 2008. Yes, it increased in 2012, but he also won less votes. In 2016, Hillary Clinton really didn't excite that many voters. I mean, 59% turnout isn't exactly the best number. African American turnout, again, percentage-wise, was larger than white turnout in 2012. Can't be the same thing in 2016. Now in 2020, I do think that African American turnout will peak over white turnout in this country, but I think that will come as a result of Joe Biden choosing a woman of color as VP. And right now, all signs are pointing towards Kamala Harris. And there's a number of other underlining signs that give us a general idea that Kamala Harris will likely be the potential VP choice. And no, I'm not just saying that because I chose Kamala Harris back in July 2017 as Joe Biden's VP. But I will say that if it does end up happening, then I would be right. But that's not my main reason why I think she will be. That's just coming from a lot of reports from insider Democrats that are very close to the Biden campaign, and they're saying that she's absolutely a top choice. And based off the numbers that we see, most people are excited about her compared to Susan Rice and Val Demings, the other two that the Democrats name. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure you go ahead and check out the video on your screen that's geared towards you, and then a playlist to my 2020 election predictions starting in the year 2020. Please consider subscribing on the left if you haven't already, and check out our Instagram and Twitter. The ads are in the bottom part of the screen. Please consider joining as a member on this channel. Comment down suggestions below, and I will see you all later today.